Thank you, Beth. So the Kennedy Center has a lecture series with different themes. You can see them around the room. This semester is the future of citizenship and global belonging. And this helps us to ask questions about belonging and participation across communities. It invites us to reflect on what it means to be included or excluded and the different ways people create meaning and solidarity in uncertain times. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Department of Anthropology, and this partnership helps to highlight how important research in disciplines like anthropology can help us to better understand individuals and communities and how they negotiate identity, care, and connections in changing times. We're honored to have Dr. Fulya Pinar, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Middlebury College, speak with us today. Her research explores displacement, refugeehood, and solidarity and belonging in Turkey and the broader Middle East. Her ethnographic work focuses on disenfranchised communities, including Syrian, Palestinian, and Iraqi refugees, as well as marginalized citizens who navigate the space between state institutions, legal status, and global humanitarian aid. Today's lecture, Beyond Legal Status, Disenfranchised Belonging and Refugee Solidarity in Turkey, draws on her extensive fieldwork with refugees in Turkey. Dr. Pila shows how migrants navigate healthcare, work, and community life in ways that challenge conventional boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. Her research offers a fresh lens on the future of citizenship, revealing how everyday practices of survival and solidarity both unsettle and reshape the systems that seek to contain them. Her work invites all of us to consider how people reimagine both citizenship and humanity from the ground up. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fulya Pinar.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Kennedy Center for International Studies, Dr. Scott Centers, Dr. Becky Schulteis, and everyone else included in the organization of this talk. It's a pleasure to join you in this conversation on the future of citizenship. All right. So we often imagine citizenship as something granted from above, a legal status, a passport, recognition by the state. But in many parts of the world, including Turkey, where I'm from and where my research takes place, citizenship is also enacted from below through everyday acts of care, labor, rumor, refusal, through the ways people organize life together in the cracks of formal governance. And my work here asks, what forms of belonging become possible when protection and care are offered selectively? I came to this question amid a decade of political transformation in the region, the Arab Spring, the Syrian civil war, and the 2013 Gezi Park protests in Turkey, all of which basically exposed both the power and the limits of popular mobilization. And in moments when formal institutions faltered, I saw that people forged new solidarities, but also new boundaries, revealing that collective action can generate justice and exclusion at once. These events foregrounded questions that became central to my research. How people create solidarities under repression, especially after displacement, and how belonging here is negotiated when protection is conditional and temporary. I spent years in Istanbul's working-class migrant districts for my ethnographic research, places like Esenyurt, Bayramtepe, Ok Meydanı, where internally displaced citizens and externally displaced refugees live side by side. And during this research, I collaborated with community centers by teaching Turkish and Turkish language and arts courses and mentoring collective storytelling projects, which became key sites for observing how solidarity and belonging were practiced in everyday life. And some of these images you're seeing on this slide are all from those moments. Basically, these neighborhoods that I worked in are shaped by overlapping histories of dispossession. Kurdish and Alevi minorities, families uprooted by conflict or urban renewal, and migrants from Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Palestine who arrived with no pathway for permanent status. Turkey hosts more refugees than any other country right now, yet governs them through temporary, conditional, and revocable categories. So this means that most non-European refugees are actually denied formal recognition in Turkey, and this of course produced deep uncertainties for a lot of people. So people may live for decades without becoming legible as citizens or even official refugees in Turkey. And in this landscape, of course, citizenship takes shape in unexpected ways. Some residents expand the reach of the state, policing borders in their neighborhoods, deciding who counts as a proper member. Others build infrastructures of mutual support, neighborhood kitchens, informal clinics, shared apartments to craft more inclusive kind of belonging. And these practices reveal that citizenship from below is not inherently emancipatory, is not inherently equal. It can reproduce exclusion or nurture solidarity, act as a weapon or a lifeline. So that is precisely why that must be studied. Decisive struggles over belonging unfold not only in parliaments or borders, but also in shops, in markets, in mosques, kitchens, churches, encrypted group chats. Moreover, observing how people carry state power in daily life prevents romanticizing community, showing how the same neighborhood that feeds a particular family can blacklist a tenant or push someone toward a border. Such attention reveals where laws and policies truly take effect, and the ethical stakes when exclusion becomes civic virtue shared by fear and pride. It pushes us to see citizenship not as just paperwork, but as practice of co-residence, care, and sometimes, yes, gatekeeping, and to locate leverage points for social change. So as we think about the future of citizenship, I invite us to first shift our lens from formal rights to everyday enactments, asking how ordinary people decide who belongs, who is protected, and what living together can mean. To understand these everyday enactments, particularly in Turkey, we first need to see the architecture that produces them, what I call an architecture of suspended citizenship in Turkey. Turkey hosts, again, more than 4 million displaced people, yet its legal and bureaucratic frameworks are deliberately fragmented. So it's a signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention, but it retains a geographical limitation, recognizing only arrivals from Europe as official refugees. Syrians and others from global south usually live under temporary or conditional protection statuses that offer residence, but that doesn't really offer permanence. It is basically revocable at any moment by a presidential decree. This structure generates chronic legal ambiguity for people. ID cards grant partial access to things like education and healthcare, but they must be constantly renewed. Rules shift between even just the districts, even neighborhoods, and entire cities periodically close registration. Travel requires special permission within Turkey for a lot of these people, and many fall through the cracks, unregistered, informally employed, and rightless. As one Syrian woman in Esenyurt once told me, every year they change the rules, so I feel like every year I start from zero. For internally displaced people in Turkey, so Turkish citizens, Kurds, Alevis, precarity takes other forms: gentrification, evictions, and surveillance in neighborhoods targeted for urban renewal or political control. They too must continually re-establish residence and belonging. To see how this state ambiguity and global architecture is lived, not just legislated, let's drop from policy scale to street level and let's see, okay, what are people doing? What does citizenship look like when it's practiced as daily improvisations rather than granted statuses? And in Bayramtepe, I will talk about a public theater scene that made basically that kind of negotiation more visible, turning this ordinary landlord-tenant encounter into a collective rehearsal for different futures. So just a moment from this neighborhood that became a classroom and the commons, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So on a July afternoon in 2017, the narrow alleys of Bayramtepe, a working class district shaped by waves of internal displacement and the arrival of Syrian, Iraqi, and Palestinian refugees, turned into a stage. Leaning against the green wall of a shanty house, I joined a small crowd gathered around three performers: a Syrian man, an Iraqi woman, and a Turkish man. They enacted a very familiar but fraught scene: a refugee couple seeking to rent a house from a Turkish landlord, sorry. The exchange began with pleasantries but quickly exposed a hierarchy. When the couple disclosed they were from Syria in this role-playing activity, the landlord's tone immediately hardened. He refused outright, "I don't rent to refugees." Their insistence, assuring steady work, regular payments, children in local schools, was met with mockery. "So, should I just be thankful you'll pay your rent?" he asked. He ended the conversation with a shout: "This is not charity. Go find somewhere else." At that point, Ceren, the drama educator facilitating this exercise from a group called My Neighbor is a Refugee, and I will talk about this, she interrupted the scene. She turned to the audience, 10 residents of Bayramtepe, a mix of Turkish citizens and displaced neighbors, and asked, "What is the problem here?" Initially, responses were very pragmatic. "It's his house, his choice. He can rent to whomever he wants." Others emphasized with the landlord's fears about refugees sometimes not being able to pay the rent or leaving without any notice. Gradually, under Ceren's guidance, the group began to recognize the structural nature of this exchange, how power, prejudice, and absence of anti-discrimination protections rendered these refugees permanently vulnerable. "These landlords have too much power," one Syrian woman then said. "They raise rents, they refuse us, we can't even complain. We are scared to lose what we already have." Ceren pressed further. What would be different? What could be different? What can we do in this kind of a situation? And what followed was a collective reimagining. One woman suggested accompanying the family to show solidarity as they were seeking housing. Another proposed connecting them with a known sympathetic landlord from the neighborhood. Others discussed advocating for municipal regulations against discriminatory refusals like this. So the performance became a workshop for political imagination, transforming a scene of exclusion into a rehearsal for solidarity. This performance, staged by My Neighbor is a Refugee, this is community mutual aid organization. It exemplifies the adapted method of forum theater developed by Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed. Boal was a Brazilian playwright, director, and activist committed to using performance as a tool for political movement and political empowerment. And he was influenced actually by Paul Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And he created participatory theater practices in the 1960s and 70s to help especially the marginalized communities rehearse some strategies for resistance and collective action. My Neighbor is a Refugee MNR facilitators like Ceren and Can use the forum not simply as a pedagogy, but as a political rehearsal, a means of dissecting the microphysics of discrimination embedded in everyday encounters, like renting a home, and repoliticizing them as collective problems. Rather than assigning blame to just individuals, Ceren guided participants to recognize the broader logics here: a housing market where ownership and citizenship align, a legal void where refugees have no recourse when treated badly by a landlord or discriminated against by a citizen, and a moral economy where refusal is framed as civic prudence. The performance exposed how governance operates through absence sometimes, through gaps in laws and policies, gaps that ordinary actors, like those in the scene, must navigate daily. In that sense, the landlord wasn't an isolated figure, but part of a broader order where protection is unevenly distributed, and his refusal reflected a global hierarchy in which some lives are secured and others are just managed. What seems like a personal decision here is actually an everyday expression of that larger politics, citizenship practiced through exclusion, and hospitality or protection conditioned by fear or scarcity. So, in this scene, forum theater became a way to turn everyday inequality into a shared question rather than a private wound. Instead of leaving the refugee family to face discrimination alone, the performance invited the entire neighborhood to step in, to analyze the scene, name the injustice, and test out some different responses together. In later interviews with MNR members, my neighbors and refugee members, they talked about how this method was also about rejecting the passivity often built into non-governmental organization-led projects where migrants appear only as beneficiaries and coexistence is measured through polite encounters. And here, spectators became spect actors, stepping into the scene, rewriting the script together, and experimenting with how solidarity might look like in practice. So each intervention throughout these forum theater experiences that I observed were basically rehearsals for real life, not a fantasy or utopia, but training for civic reflexes, how to recognize discrimination, how to speak up, how to act collectively. Citizenship in this sense wasn't a legal status really, but a learned capacity, the ability to deliberate, to intervene, and imagine alternatives in everyday conflicts. For Ceren and her collaborators, the goal wasn't integration, but politicization. They called this work a refusal of projectism, projecilik in Turkish. They used this term to explain the short-term, donor-driven projects that often take place in non-governmental organizations, NGOs, or humanitarian organizations. And Ceren told me these organizations treat coexistence like a checklist. That's not what we are doing here. We are recreating coexistence. Instead, they drew on some local traditions that I'll explain in a minute, expanding them to include migrants, refugees as co-residents with equal stakes in the neighborhood's future. Forum theater extended these ethics into imagination. By collectively rewriting the scene, residents weren't just fixing one injustice, they were rehearsing the kind of a shared world they wanted to inhabit together. And the rules of justice, they need to sustain it. So the Bayramtepe performance here reveals how citizenship from below cuts both ways. Neighborhoods, ties, can wound as much as they can heal. They can spread rumor, they can police morals, they can reinforce hierarchy, or they can build solidarities that challenge structural violence and global disparities. I chose this scene because MNR's aim here was to surface this very tension instead of smoothing it over. Through staged disagreements, Forum Theater here invited participants to face their own complicity and experiment with some fairer responses. So studying these kinds of practices keeps us from maybe romanticizing the idea of community. Belonging isn't naturally inclusive sometimes. It's something argued over, negotiated again and again, and performed again and again. It's a practice. It also shows how everyday judgments can override formal law, quietly deciding who gets to stay or who gets to belong. And it reminds us that fighting discrimination takes more than just literacy, right? It means grappling with the moral emotions too, fear, pride, duty, that make exclusion feel righteous. So the conceptual takeaway here, right? The Bayram Tepe Forum Theater shows citizenship as collective world making in a sense. It turns an everyday act of exclusion into a political workshop where neighborhoods could test new responses and new relations to property, to difference and authority. In doing so, MNR transformed fragile coexistence into a space of shared learning in a landscape where official protections are uncertain for a lot of people. These performances did more than just raise awareness. They built this kind of a civic muscle, the habits, solidarities, and reflexes needed to act together when the legal or political fields might fall short, right? So the lesson here was simple but radical. Citizenship isn't something you have necessarily, it's something you practice collectively and every day. To see where this forum theater work came from, we need to look at the network behind it. My Neighbor is a Refugee, MNR. It was born in 2015 out of small neighborhood collectives in Istanbul's working class districts. Again, places like Bayramtepe, Ok Meydanı. These were already zones of displacement, home to Kurdish families uprooted in the 1990s from their villages in southeast Turkey, Alevi communities long surveilled by the state, and newly arriving migrants from Syria, Iraq, and Africa. MNR didn't start as an NGO, it started as a gathering of residents who knew that who knew what precarity basically felt like. And people who had learned, often painfully, that waiting for the state or for international aid rarely brought justice. They came together to build something different, not a service provider, not a charity, but a network of mutual care and shared action. They called this a solidarity network, but in practice, it also became a laboratory for alternative citizenship, a place to test how belonging could be practiced. And at its core, it had a double move: refusal and replacement. First, they refused what they called projectism. Again, like I said, the short term, donor driven project culture that dominates refugee governance usually. In those worlds, coexistence gets measured through some needs indicators, numbers of workshops held, how many participants came, right? While deeper inequalities often remain untouched. And MNR turned away from that kind of a logic. Instead, they practiced what they called emek etmek, literally to labor, but in their usage, a way of expanding solidarity, labor, beyond ownership or transaction. So labor here wasn't something you gave or spent. They were very deliberate about this. It was something you carried together through shared time, through shared meals, and through daily presence. Second, they rejected the discourse of hospitality, misafirperverlik. The Turkish ideal of hospitality that casts refugees as guests and expects them to be grateful in return and leave, right, before their time is up. So guests, by definition, must eventually leave, right? Even that framing is problematic when we're talking about asylum seekers. So MNR insisted on something else here: hemşerilik, being fellow townspeople, and komşuluk, neighborly relations. These were vernacular forms of belonging already familiar in Istanbul's peripheral districts, and MNR stretched them to include newcomers. If you share the street, if you share the apartment building, then you share the struggle. If you live in the same place, you use the same park, you use the same services, you have a right to say, you have a right to claim things for your community, and these, just living in a place together, sharing a space together, makes you part of the neighborhood's moral and political life, not your legal status. So rather than chasing grants or producing glossy success stories we often see in humanitarian organization reports about refugees, MNR invested in this very slow, grounded, and participatory work. They called this experimenting with solidarity, which became my main concept over time. This was not a slogan, but it was a method, really a rigorous, deliberate method. It meant trying things out, failing, revising, and trying again. It meant turning uncertainty into malleable practice. Their aim wasn't charity or service delivery, but building shared capacities to survive, to speak, and to stay put. Through weekly meetings, shared kitchens, and neighborhood projects, they turned marginal districts into these kinds of civic workshops, spaces where displaced citizens and refugees could co design the terms of coexistence, but also sometimes even they would co design the community spaces like parks and community organizations together, and they would advocate to make those realities. So, how did this solidarity experiment actually look like in practice? MNR's work can be understood, I think, as what I call commoning citizenship. I use commoning here as a verb, not a noun, to emphasize that commons are not necessarily things that we inherit. They are things we make and maintain together. I follow here scholars like Peter Limbaugh, Massimo De Angelis, Silvia Federici, Gibson Graham, and Stavros Stavrides. A commons isn't just a shared space or resource, it's a set of relationships, a responsibility, like a set of responsibilities, and practices that have to be continually enacted. In the same way, citizenship here isn't to be understood as a legal status handed from above, it's a shared practice built from below. To common citizenship, then, commoning citizenship, means to turn everyday life into spaces where people collectively decide how to live together, how to distribute care, and how to confront global disparities and inequalities. Rather than waiting for inclusion through rights or paperwork, MNR's members tried to build this kind of inclusion through practice. Shared labor, mutual recognition, collective decision making. And three practices anchored this work. Again, expanding labor was one part of it. Emek etmek. They rethought basically what means labor. Instead of treating care as volunteer service or professional expertise, they approached it as a shared practice, a living, circulating form of work that connects people. And members raised funds not through grants or donors, but through their own collective creativity. They sold handmade notebooks, cooked and shared meals together. They pooled small contributions from neighbors to provide like heating sources to each other. They were intentional about language, so they avoided phrases like to give labor or to spend labor or to help people. Because almost all of these, to them, they seemed like they suggested some ownership, something you possess rather than something that you transfer and carry forward. Emek etmek, as opposed to these, means something different. It means to practice labor relationally, to stretch it across time and through others. In their view, solidarity wasn't a product to hand out, it was a muscle that had to be used, that had to be trained and kept alive. By expanding labor beyond job titles or project outcomes, MNR refused the logic of projectism, the idea that care must be scheduled, measured, and closed out at the end of a funding cycle. Their kitchens and mutual aid spaces were not deliverables, they were civic infrastructures built on repetition and trust, proof that politics can live in the slow work of maintaining one another. The second important theme that they used was aligning with the neighborhood, which is in Turkish mahalleye inmek. So this is a very spatial term, literally coming down to the neighborhood. It was their answer to an old phrase used by elites to mean descending to the people, halka inmek. Instead of parachuting to fix problems, MNR members deliberately chose to walk alongside their neighbors, sitting in tea houses, chatting in grocery stores, attending funerals and weddings, sharing everyday time. And through this kind of a steady presence, they came to understand the neighborhood not as a backdrop, but as a teacher. The space as a teacher. They learned its rhythms, they learned its conflicts, codes of care. Coexistence was not imagined as harmony, it was a daily negotiation, sometimes tense, sometimes messy, but often relational. So Mahalliye inmek here, it turns the neighborhood into a site of pedagogy, in a sense, a place where fairness could be debated and where the boundaries of belonging were collectively worked out. Residents here didn't just adapt to existing rules. Together, they asked what justice should look like here among these specific people in the shared place. And finally, they reimagined the everyday ethics of belonging through what they called hemşerilik and komşuluk, like I explained. So traditionally, these terms refer to ties among people from the same hometown and obligations between neighbors. And MNR stretched both ideas. Belonging wasn't about origin, it was about co-residence. If you share a street, you share responsibility. This redefinition wasn't just moral, it was a very political and legal intervention because under Article 13 of Turkey's municipal law, anyone residing in a district, citizen or not, has the right to participate in local decisions. So MNR used that clause basically to argue that refugees are not guests but rightful stakeholders with claims to the commons they all help to sustain. And in daily life, these principles showed up in a small but powerful modes of gestures, bringing soup to a new neighbor, visiting the sick, sharing grief and funerals, standing together in city council meetings to demand water, electricity, housing, heating. Each act said, you belong because you are here with us now. These weren't acts of charity again, they were citizenship in action, a form of commoning grounded not in documents or bloodlines, but in shared space, shared time, and shared care. So across these practices, MNR turned an absence of formal rights, state care, and international protection, or resources also, into an arena for invention and experimentation. Their work shows that when institutions withdraw, people often don't just endure it, don't just survive it, they improvise new infrastructures of belonging. This is what it means to common citizenship, to turn a shared vulnerability into shared capacity and to treat coexistence not as tolerance, but as collective world making. However, of course, these practices were never pure or easy. MNR's solidarity was powerful, but it was also very fragile, constantly stretched by the very conditions it tried to confront. Sustainability was a daily challenge for them. Members were juggling precarious jobs themselves, caregiving, and their own displacement histories. Burnout was a very common thing. The network relied on unpaid emotional and physical labor, much of it carried by women, organizing meetings, cooking meals, mediating conflicts. These were very gendered matters. That unevenness sometimes reproduced the very hierarchies they wanted to undo. These were also there were also some deep anxieties about becoming what they resisted. Some members worried that voluntary labor could end up masking or compensating for state neglect instead of challenging that state neglect, what one collaborator called doing the government's job for free. They feared turning into what scholars name moral neoliberals, citizens who fill welfare gaps out of compassion, unintentionally legitimizing the system that creates those kinds of gaps. And the question haunted them. Are we building alternatives or are we just cushioning abandonment? Another recurring tension was institutionalization. So as refugee care became a more and more well-funded sector in Turkey through European Union funds, some members argued for forming an official NGO to access resources, pay salaries, and scale their impact a bit, while still staying true to their values. Others saw this as an immediate betrayal, a slide into projectism. So the very project logic they opposed, they were very scared of it coming to their own circles. Debates over this then exposed some class divides. Those with stable income could afford radical refusal like that, but those without that kind of a stable income, they saw formalization as a necessity for survival. So the conflict eventually fractured this network, which today continues in forms of multiple other networks. These tensions don't necessarily mean failure. They reveal something essential. Citizenship from below is always unfinished. It's not a blueprint, but a practice. It's very iterative, experimental, and it's very vulnerable. MNR's story shows that grassroots citizenship doesn't emerge from consensus necessarily. It's forged through friction, through constant negotiation over labor, legitimacy, and care. What they built, I argue, shouldn't be understood as utopia, but it was a living workshop where solidarity had to be rehearsed again and again, citizenship had to be done again and again. Their fragility, in that sense, is very instructive for us. It reminds us that building alternatives to exclusionary systems is very slow work, easily undone, and always in need of renewal. But it also shows that even temporary experiments like shared kitchens, neighborhood meetings, street performances, they can leave very durable traces. New habits of attention, new languages of justice, new ways of staying with one another. Citizenship, this shows, is not a stable possession. It's a verb, something people do together imperfectly in the midst of uncertainty. So what do we learn from these experiments? First, that refusal can be generative, following scholars like Audrey Simpson, Savannah Shange, and Carol McGranahan. Refusing projectism, refusing the logic of hospitality, refusing the logic of NGOization, right? Of donor timelines, guest status, transactional care, didn't end with critique. They became blueprints for new relations. So refusal shouldn't be understood as an end to something, but it's the beginning. Kitchens run by neighbors, plays that turn audiences into citizens, labor that circulates like a gift. Second, MNR's work helps us think about commoning citizenship. If citizenship is usually imagined as something one holds, MNR shows what it looks like as a practice. Citizenship as something done, performed, not owned. In this frame, belonging then is not a status simply given, it's a relation continually made and remade. And this leads again to the beginning, to the future of citizenship. Maybe the crucial question is not who has papers or who crosses borders legally, but who co-labors to sustain life, who shows up again and again to keep the commons alive, to make possible, to mediate, to rehearse justice. That work, often invisible, is where the future of citizenship is already being practiced. So, circling back to our opening question, what might the future of citizenship look like when protection is selective and recognition is uncertain? The story of MNR offers one possible answer. It shows us that citizenship's future may lie in the shared work of sustaining life, acts that are small, fragile, sometimes very exhausting, but also deeply political, turning uncertainty into experimentation. If citizenship has always been a promise, unevenly kept, then these experiments remind us that it can also be a practice continually renewed. Not something we hold, but something we do together again and again. One of MNR's members, Cengiz, put it best when I asked what kept him going. He said, "You don't finish solidarity, you just keep practicing it." That, I think, captures the very heart of it. Citizenship's future, likewise, is not a finished design, is not a finished project. It's an ongoing attempt to build livable worlds with others. And in that ongoing trying, we find both its fragility and its hope. Thank you.
So much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. There's a couple microphones, so if you could make sure you use the microphone so we can hear and give us your name and where you're from and your major.
Hi. Hi, my name's Baylin. I'm a nursing major and I'm from Arizona. And I was just kind of wondering some of the background. Like, what is the reason that all these European and non European immigrants are choosing to find refuge in Turkey?
Mm-hmm. So it's mostly non-European refugees. Thank you for that question. In Turkey, a lot of people either choose Turkey or they end up there because they cannot go any further than that because of the limitations of Europe. And they usually arrive from Turkey's southeast or eastern borders. So we are talking about Iraq, um, sometimes Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Palestine. So it's mostly refugees are arriving from those kinds of places. The background and the limitation about who can and cannot be considered official refugees. So the original 1951 UN Convention on Refugees actually had this limitation, geographic limitation, about providing that kind of official protection, universal protection, to people arriving from European boundaries, borders. And that was to protect, of course, the Jewish communities that were running away, fleeing violence, Holocaust back then. And then Turkey kept that geographical limitation to control its migrant population. So Turkey only provides official refugee status to European refugees, but they are only like 20, 25 people in numbers. And then the rest of it are protected through temporary or conditional or subsidiary protection statuses. Yeah.
My name is Matt Johnston. I'm a political science major, and I'm from Heber City. My question was, well, I thought the pushback against projectism, projectelijk, was interesting. How was my neighbor as a refugee able to kind of sustain itself when it didn't really conform to the traditional system of grants and metrics of success?
Yeah, very good question. And they did struggle, right, with that. They did struggle a lot with money. So they sold whatever they could make, notebooks, anything craft related, they would make together. We would meet like 20 people doing notebooks and then trying to sell them outside. They would sometimes sew things, they would make scarves. So it was really about their labor, really. A lot of labor was included in that. And then they would do some crowdsourcing when a certain amount of money was needed to sustain the community center. Of course, they had rent to pay, right? So for those, they would do some crowdsourcing. And a lot of people actually gave some of their own money, although they worked in very precarious jobs themselves, to contribute to the community. But yeah, it was hard to sustain. Yeah, that's why some members wanted to establish an official NGO. Rica ederim.
I'm Connor McCulloch from Cedar Hills, Utah. I was curious a little bit about how you think that this kind of community aspect to approaching citizenship can help people that don't have legal permission to work. I've met lots of people in like Istanbul or Ankara who didn't have permission to work, and so that was their big problem. How can a community kind of bond together to provide, I guess, opportunities for labor and for income?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, that's an unfinished thing, right? It's not really no perfect solution to that was found. But yes, about 90% of refugees in Turkey right now work as informal workers. And that means they work below minimum wage and also they don't have any benefits, right? They don't have like social security or anything like that. And on top of that, if they're also unregistered, which doesn't mean that they're just irregular migrants, but also could just mean that they registered somewhere else and they're living in somewhere else now. There are so many limitations around space, and that's exactly why this organization was so space-based, right? So they had this community center in one particular neighborhood, but then they would also go to other neighborhoods and just find one space together to meet every week with people, and to establish kind of the understanding of fellow townspeople and neighborly relations together to kind of expand that understanding beyond themselves to the neighbors, to the Turkish neighbors, so that they would accept and help these people when needed. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarai. I'm a cultural anthropology master's student from Denver, Colorado. And I find belonging to be quite a fascinating topic and really beautiful that human beings do it again and again. And when you were saying that belonging is something that needs to be negotiated again and again, and this seemed to be my interpretation of a reaction to the political sphere. Are there other social and cultural spheres that belonging, you believe, is a reaction to, or for these refugees, is it mostly a political manifestation of that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, there are definitely tensions around ethnicity, religion, national background. Like some Iraqi people, for example, are Turkmens who are closer to ethnicity, in Turkish ethnicity, of course, and they sometimes want to be treated a bit better than Kurdish Iraqis, for example. So there are definitely those kinds of tensions. And then you have, of course, gender related tensions. You have like age-based tensions that keep happening, or class-based tensions, right? So that's why I'm saying it has to be negotiated and done again and again, because it can't be finished, because there are just too many differences that I understand solidarity as a negotiation of similarities and differences, basically. And I think when we look at it that way, it's very clear that we can't really be done with it. Yeah.
One more question.
My name is Garrett Ride. I'm studying bioinformatics, and I'm from Connecticut. Of course, there are a number of cultural differences between the United States and Turkey that might impact the implementation of a program like My Neighbor is a Refugee. How would you recommend implementing a similar program while taking into account the cultural differences in another area?
In the U.S.?
In the U.S., yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think here you might already have similar things to My Neighbor is a Refugee through community organizations, maybe some churches, community centers for Muslim people, right? So you already do have examples like that. But I think here the formality informality binary is a bit more, a bit tougher. In Turkey, there are things, especially in a big city like Istanbul, right? We're talking about a city with 17 million people. So it's easy to go off the radar. But here, I think the tension to deal with is formality versus solidarity, how to balance that kind of professionalism with intentional, careful, caring solidarity. I think that is the tension that you might need to figure out in the U.S. Of course.
Thank you, Professor Pinar.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.